Without further ado, let's get on with today's webinar. Really excited to talk about how do we solve the retention crisis that we're going through. And what we're going to do is just set the scene, which is really important so you understand the context of what's happening. Then we want to get a little bit into our philosophy of how we approach retention, really dig into the research, what it's showing us so far. As I said, that's the start of the journey. It's not necessarily the end, and it is evolving. And then finish with some practical steps to maximize retention. Really keen, as we said, please do ask questions as we go along, and I'll keep an eye on those as we do. Without further ado, let me introduce Dominic and Jodie, who will be taking us through today. So Jodie, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself first.
Lovely, thank you, Matt. So yes, really great to be here today. I'm an engagement consultant at Impulse. My name is Jodie Harrison, and I used to work on the customer success team. I do see some names in there, so hello if we've worked together previously, but my role now is more based around engagement.
Fantastic, thanks Jodie. And Dominic.
Hi, I'm Dominic Walters. I'm Director of Consulting at Impulse. My job is really to work with our clients to help them frame their surveys, but then tackle the issues that come out of the surveys. And that gets us involved in all sorts of stuff, from developing strategies to a lot of coaching and working with leaders as well.
Fantastic. And I can't tell you guys, hold on, because we're going to get some amazing, I'm going to start with Dom and we're going to get into some of the philosophy, just so you understand, because the context is important. But stay with us, because we're going to get into some absolutely fascinating data with Jodie around what are the key emotions that indicate people are going to leave? What are the key questions that indicate people are going to leave? And how do we use that in our retention strategy? So you don't want to miss that, to find out what are those key emotions, and also what are some of the themes that keep people and help retain them, and what are some of those themes that lead to people leaving. So stick with us, we'll get there in about 15-20 minutes. But before that, we just want to set out what the challenge, the scale of what we're facing. So Dom, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Well, we were talking earlier about the petrol crisis, which I know is affecting different parts of the country in different ways. But I think that's one manifestation of what everyone's talking about, this idea of the Great Resignation. And look at some stats behind this. We can see Microsoft told us that nearly half of the global workforce will consider leaving their employer in the next year. Monster, you may well know, a leading recruitment organization, has said that nearly 100%, 95% of workers are at least contemplating a job change. But I think most of us anecdotally can back this up. You know, many of us will know people who over the course of the pandemic and beyond have suddenly thought, actually, I don't want to go back to what I was doing, or I don't want to do it in the same way. So there are lots of people having conversations about their role, their jobs, their organizations they're working for, and many people looking to change. And you may well have seen lots of articles in the Sunday papers about people doing just that, giving up a professional job to go and do something vastly different. So we call this a retention crisis. I think that's a fair assumption. It's a fair way of describing it, because lots of people are feeling this, and we're seeing this through our clients. But let's look in a bit more detail at why it's important. Thank you, Matt. You could say, well, surely it's a good thing if people are empowered to go and develop their career, and it is, but it brings costs and downsides to organizations. And the first one is, and many of us will know this, it costs money. If you look at the Work Foundation, they've estimated it takes a third of a salary to replace people. That's probably quite a conservative estimate, to be frank. We've heard others say it could be up to 100% of a person's salary to replace them. So it's expensive, but it also knocks organizations about. When you've put time and effort into engaging people, building a culture, and people start to leave, it knocks all that sideways, and people then start to get concerned and anxious. And we've seen this with a number of our clients where some key people have left, and people start to look around and say, what does this mean for us? And how's it going to affect my relationships? I guess also it makes us far less able to do the stuff we're good at. If we lose the skills we need, it takes a while to bring new skills on board, it knocks our productivity. And we've found with a number of our clients, particularly those who are rapidly growing, they have said the biggest single break in our development and growth now is we can't get good people. And it's a very frustrating situation to be in when there's demand to be filled and you can't do it because you can't get people. We know that particularly in client-facing professions, where people build up strong relationships with clients and then individuals move on, that creates a potential break point with the client. Either they move with the client, or at very least, it causes a breakup in the relationship and how well the client deals with the organization. And I guess the last thing is, and we've seen a lot of this, it becomes infectious. We know that if people start to move on, that fear of missing out kicks in with lots of other people working there who might suddenly start to say, actually, I'm going to look around as well. So we've definitely seen with clients, when several people start to move, it has a knock-on effect with other people there. So I think this summarizes that it's important to tackle it. It's something we should be thinking about. It's damaging organizations. So what's the reality? First of all, it's an evident fact that people move when they can move elsewhere. I've spoken to my relatives who are in the job market in the 60s, and one of the constant refrains is what a wonderful time it was to be a worker, because you could walk out of a job on a Friday and go into another one on a Monday. And we're not far off that now. If you look at these stats, now, most job vacancies for 2 decades, unemployment, for those of us who've studied economics, we're actually at full employment because we're at 4.7% of unemployment. And then if you look at pay, the ONS, Office for National Statistics, has told us that pay has gone up by nearly 8% in the last year. So big impact there in terms of the stats around jobs, what's available. But what's different, I think, is where those shortages are hitting. And it's not just in those businesses where you expect a fair amount of churn, such as on the slide, hospitality and so on. It really is biting in other areas which traditionally haven't really suffered so much from lots of churn, lots of retention issues, such as accounting and IT and engineering. And if you listen to the CBI, it's not going to get much better very quickly. They've said, as you can see, that it's going to last at least 2 years, this shortage of staff. It may go on even more, and in some different parts of the economy, it may extend for another decade, we've heard. So that means that it's even more important now to keep the good people that we've got.
Sorry, Dom. I was going to say, I think, to be honest, there's a real risk management issue here, for the CFOs and the sort of finance gurus in a corporate company. If ever there was a kind of argument to make to them, based even just on some of what you've raised here, this that managing this is a real part of risk management for the organization, and to ignore it is kind of crazy, really.
Absolutely, yeah. Particularly as we know, it's incredibly hard to tackle because we've seen increase in pay, but that's only one small part of it. And I was interested in this set of facts from Indeed, who put looking for a higher salary as number 2, but there's lots of other stuff that influence people, their decisions. And it's those things really that we want to focus on today, looking at the evidence from the clients we've worked with, and then coming up with some ideas and thoughts around it.
Yeah, and just on that last one, I think it's really interesting for everyone watching. Please do note that and steal it with pride around the sort of top 6 reasons. So many of them actually come back, I would say 1 to 3, 4, 5, and 6, only the second one, often are still linked to the line manager, because as we know, we say people don't necessarily leave organizations, they leave leaders. And if you're feeling uninspired, I'd kind of partly look to the line manager going, well, how are they sort of leading and managing that person? Value, wanting to be valued, typically comes from your first line of reporting. Obviously, the 5 is very clear. And even 6 is like, well, that's the manager's role in a sense. She's got to keep an eye on the job, the kind of desire that people have to change and move into different roles. So still, it's very linked to, if you like, the microcosm of the team and the line manager. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's very, very fair. Well, we'll look later at the fact that the line manager become even more important in the last 18 months, because for many people, the line manager is the organization. It's the main point of contact. Yeah.
And just for everyone listening, we're kind of sharing this and giving these stats because sometimes you don't get the chance to go and pull all this data together, but you get asked for it. And so we wanted to kind of help you, that, as we said, we'll send these out to you so you can kind of bring this maybe to your people director or the person that you're trying to convince to say, look, we've got to take retention seriously and think about what we do.
So let's look a bit at our philosophy. As Matt mentioned, there are a number of people who are veterans of these webinars, so you would know this, but if you're new, you may not. Our central philosophy is around the power of emotions. So whenever we do a survey with a client, the first 2 questions are always, how do you feel about a particular issue? And then why? And the real reason for this is we know emotions are important because they drive behavior. Emotions are not just the symptoms of the behavior, but they really drive it. And that's even more the case when you look at retention. And we'll come on to this, but someone's decision to stay or leave a job is a very emotionally led decision. So emotions are even more important looking at issues than others. And the other thing is to understand why people feel the way they do. By asking them that will then give you a clear pointer as to what you can do, the levers that you have to start to change emotions as well. Let's sorry.
And it's fair to say, Dom, that it was a punt from me. It was a step of faith, if you like, to 6 years ago when we started Impulse on the platform side to go, I think this is going to be the key to employee experience, to employee engagement, is actually how employees are feeling and the why. And the why is critical, as you say, because that shows you where their mind is at, it shows you where their focus is at, and therefore how you can help to solve some of the emotion issues that may be emerging.
Don't just take our word for it. There are lots of leading thinkers in those areas as elements, if you like, that make up people's decisions to stay or go from an organization who back it up. Let's start with behavior. So Bandler around NLP, he says, look, how we feel has a big influence on how we respond to situations. So again, people choose to leave an organization is going to be driven by emotion. Daniel Pink, talking about motivation, as we know, he talks about purpose, mastery, and autonomy being some of the key aspects of intrinsic motivation, that motivation that comes from within us. But a lot of that is down to the joy that we have with our work, how we feel about the work. So again, emotions help us understand motivation. One of my favorites, Daniel Kahneman, who writes about the psychology of decision-making, he says that however logical we are, and many of us would like to think we're very logical, emotions have a massive impact on decision-making, particularly in areas around retention. This struck me recently. I was watching Quadrophenia last weekend. You may be aware of Quadrophenia, a film from the late 70s about mods and rockers in Brighton. And there's a scene where in the 60s, it's set in the 60s, where the main protagonist, Jimmy, in very fruitful language, tells his boss what he can do with his job. It's a very emotional response. And there we are, someone said, we are the mods, indeed, a line from the film. Thank you very much.
I was going to make a really cheap joke and sound far too young for that, Dom. I'm not sure I was born in the 70s, mate.
The reason I mention it, though, is the boss's response to Jimmy giving in his resignation in the way he does is completely practical. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. Whereas the emotion is very, sorry, the reason is very emotional. So people make decisions around retention or around staying in a role very much driven by emotion. And then lastly, well-being, something we've all been focusing on really in the last 18 months particularly. And you got Zegelman, the guru of well-being, who's saying what really drives well-being is personal happiness. And that's down to how we feel. So I think there's some leading thinkers who look at different aspects of how people make decisions who are agreeing that emotions are very, very powerful. And it's worth spending time looking at them and understanding what lies behind them. Go to the next slide, please, Matt. Thank you very much. And we know that we have a very eclectic group of people listening to these webinars. There'll be many people who are well versed in classical times. So it's not just modern thinkers. Going back to Plato, said that human behavior comes from these three things: desire, emotion, and knowledge. So it's a well-established truth.
You know what I love you've done there, Dom, is you've linked, the decision we made 6 years ago with the great ancient philosopher Plato. He appears in my book somewhere, people. He really does.
Yes.
It's Friday. We're having a bit of fun. But on a serious point, for me, as you know, Dom, and just for everyone listening, the reason we're sharing about why emotion is so important is because actually a lot of what we're going to bring to you is around the data Jodie's going to be sharing in the next 5-10 minutes, is actually around what the emotions and how people are feeling is showing us when it comes to retention. And I was just actually on a pitch earlier this week, and the HR director made a really interesting point when she saw our screens, and she saw that we actually ask people how they feel. It's a range of emotions and then the why. And she said, it's so funny, up until now, we ask them lots of questions, and then we sit here with the data trying to work out how they feel, from questions like leadership, from questions about pride in the organization, EMPS. So we literally try and then go, so do you think they're feeling sad? Do you think they're feeling excited? Do you think they're feeling hopeful? This actually gives us how they're feeling. It kind of makes sense. Like, yes, definitely. And if just the last thing to say, and then we'll move on. COVID sped up, no doubt it sped up the need to be aware of how your people are feeling and why. And so if you're not measuring that to me is crazy, because by the way, they're feeling that anyway, and you not knowing makes no sense whatsoever, because they're feeling it and they're acting in a certain way regardless. So understanding it, being aware of it, means you can do something about it. There's a great phrase in coaching: awareness precedes action. What you're aware of you can control, what you're not aware of controls you. So we'd be really advocating for you to make sure that you're thinking about how your people are feeling it and measuring it. But Dom, I think you've done a superb job convincing all of our participants today that this is well grounded in some good thinking.
Well, let me just finish it off then, Matt, by saying, well, what are we seeing then? Let's look at some evidence to back up our contention that emotions drive behavior. We've seen, Gartner's has told us that lots of organizations are now focused on life experience. So moving on from the employee experience and looking at other aspects of people's lives and how they can support and help them with that. And when they've done that, it increases people's mental and physical health. We've seen that 74.75%, three-quarters of employees are now starting to demand a stance from their organizations around important political issues, ethical issues. We're seeing that more and more a factor in people's decisions about the organizations they want to stay in.
And Dom, not to, sorry to steal your thunder, but wait till Gen Z really get into the workplace. They're just beginning to enter it now. It's about 16 to 25, depending on who you
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the webinar we'll be doing in 3 weeks, we'll be looking at all about, but they are absolutely about this, that they expect companies to have a voice, have an opinion, and take a stance on political and societal issues.
Yes, and organizations are starting to take note of this. So it was interesting, we saw an IOIC, the Institute of Internal Comms, did a survey a couple of months ago, and in that survey, about 1,000 organizations, largely in the UK, but also in Europe. Again, nearly half of those organizations are planning some sort of culture change in the next year. And they're doing that because they realize they have to change the way they behave with their employees, largely because of retention. And then we've got 70% are looking at well-being and mental health as a priority as well, which I think led the IOIC to summarize quite usefully that 2021 and beyond really is going to be the year of empathy. And we know that leaders are going to be called to that, and we'll come back to that in a few moments. So organizations are starting to take note and starting to change the way they behave.
Yeah, and just to put a number on that, there is a current NHS bid on their system for, I think it's £3 million to coach their leaders to have more compassion and to show empathy. Incredible. It closes for those of you interested in November. But I was like, wow, that's putting your money where your mouth is, that they're spending that amount of money on in I think it's about 5 NHS trusts. They want to do that, so covering about 20,000 people. I was like, wow, that's a real commitment to wanting their leaders to show empathy and compassion. Thank you, Dom. That you did a really, really great, just kind of really setting the context. I hope everyone found that useful. You get those slides. Don't worry, all those stats are there. You can take them and steal them with pride, as we said. And genuinely, just to reiterate, we've done this because we think that what we find is when we work with the corporates is sometimes they need power and strength to kind of help their arguments internally, particularly people in the HR people teams. And so pulling that data together can hopefully help you as you have your conversations internally. But I'm really excited for Jody to take over the reins and really share with us something a bit about the context of the data. We're then going to look at this identifying at-risk populations, what's the impact on engagement, emotions and themes, and then other key indicators. But so Jody, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll jump in on the first one, which is around the context of the data. So this is just important to explain a little bit about where the data's come from, so what we're looking at. So all of the data that we're going to see today has come from engagement surveys that have been run in the last 2 years, where a question has been included to ask people directly about retention, so about their intentions. Some examples of these are up at the top here. So I intend to still be working here in 12 months' time, or I'm not looking to leave in the next 12 months. There are other variations as well, but these are the most commonly used questions. So the first thing that becomes clear as soon as we look at this question in particular, but also the surveys in general where this data is coming from, is how rich it is. There's so much information behind this question. So people are really telling us, which is great. And we'll come on to how we don't actually even need to have this question included per se, because we've got all the other indicators anyway, which will give us that information regardless. So an important figure here, 13% of employees are answering the retention question negatively in these surveys, indicating that they're planning to leave. If we compare this to external data on retention rates or turnover rates, you can see how close these are. So we've got 15% there from Monster, 12% from Glassdoor, and we're in the middle there really at around 13% who are saying that they're going to leave. And I think being able to sort of deduce from that those who say they're going to leave are likely those people who probably do then go on to leave is really important, and it gives us confidence when we then look at the reasons behind it that these figures do match up and they're valid. So if we have a quick look at how... Yeah, sure.
To say for everyone listening that when you pulled the data together, and I should have said this up front, my bad, this is the data we're going to show you is across 10 clients, about 40,000 points of data, global in scope, and typically it's companies 500 plus responses and size. So just so people have got the context for the data we're about to show. Over to you, sorry.
Yes, no, perfect, thank you. So I want to demonstrate here how we can see this data on the platform. And this is just one example of the many ways that we can delve into it, but the heat maps are particularly perfect for a question like this. So just to explain what we're seeing here, the data that you see in the cells, it is all for demo purposes, but what we've got here is the results for the question of I can see myself working here in 12 months' time. So it's the positive score for that question. So the green shading is the slightly better scores, and then the colours scaling down to the yellow, orange and red is showing where there's areas which could do with some improvement. So what's really great here is the ways that you can cut the data. Down the left-hand side, an example here, we've got the teams or departments within the organisation. And then up at the top, we've got length of service, age, and ethnicity as well. So your eye can immediately be drawn to where there might be an issue. And if we can pull out some scores, we might pull out a whole team, for example. If we look at HR, they've actually got the lowest score overall for this example, but you can see that all the way across, it's quite yellow and orange. And then you might also be immediately drawn to that 31 to 40 age range as well, because that's sort of yellow and orange all the way down. So the great thing about this is actually you may already have the retention rates or the turnover rates for a particular team because you know how many people are leaving. But with that other way of cutting the data as well, you can have the bigger picture of, is it people of a certain age, a certain ethnicity, are there other characteristics that go along with it?
Yeah, I think it's very helpful to see across different segments, as you say, rather than just within one, so you can start to see where the issues are, because it is, bisectional, if you like, in how you need to see it. So thanks for that.
Brilliant. So let's have a look at the impact of this on, first of all, engagement here, and then we'll look at emotions as well. So what are these figures telling us? In the middle, we've got 66% average. That's the average engagement index score for the surveys we're looking at that have got that retention question included. If we then look at the effect that those who have answered the retention question negatively has on the engagement index, it drops all the way down to 36. And on the positive side, it boosts all the way up to 88. I think it's really important to remember here that 36%, that only represents that 13% of the population, because we saw it's the 13% that are answering negatively. We can see just how it's a huge difference, and we can see how much they're pulling the overall score down. And we're saying actually without those 13%, or if we move those 13% more to be more positive, we could get engagement so much higher overall.
It's quite interesting. It shows you the impact of people thinking about leaving and what that's doing to probably multiple corporate companies' engagement. The other thing just to say to everyone as well, engagement index, I'm sure you're all aware of it, but effectively it's typically 3 to 5 questions that a company sets as being the most important questions to focus on and creating their engagement index. Whereas the emotion is, how do you feel about working at Impulse? And then it's a range of emotions, and you get to choose up to 2. First one is what we call a primary dominant emotion. It's kind of top of brain, it's what they're feeling. And then the second is the more thoughtful, deeper emotion that, as they've given themselves some time to think about it, comes out. But Jodie, I'll pass it back over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So it's what we should consider next is that relationship between retention and engagement, and of course emotions. So it's almost like which comes first, what is the connection between them? And what we're really asking is which is the leading indicator and which is the lagging. So before we delve a little bit deeper into the themes and emotions, let's talk a little bit about what this means. We'll start with the lagging, actually, because a lagging indicator is generally a little bit easier to describe. It's easier to know what they are. It can be described as something that's already happened. A lagging indicator will quantify the current conditions. So this would be your turnover rate that you know what the figure is. Generally, they can be quite difficult to change, or they can take quite a lot of time to influence as well. So we've had those turnover rates of around 12 or 15%, and it may take a while to see the knock-on effect on those scores. But what we need to focus on really is the leading indicator. The leading indicator is more of a predictive measurement. It's more about looking ahead to the future, and it can, fortunately, be much easier to influence, but often a lot harder to measure. And I think this links quite nicely into what Matt said earlier about the company that was trying to figure out how people feel based off other questions. It can be difficult to measure how people feel, but that's exactly what we're doing here. And we're able to measure that so that we can then influence the retention rates further down.
Yeah.
So let's have a look in a little bit more detail at which emotions exactly are coming up and the reasons behind them. So again, what we're looking at here is the results based off that retention question. On the left-hand side in the green, we've got the positive results, and then on the right-hand side, the negative results. So we can see immediately that the negative answers to the retention question goes hand in hand with some very strongly negative emotions. We're not seeing people sitting on the fence. We're not seeing indifferent. We've got disconnected, irritated, anxious, which is, of course, almost the polar opposite to the positive side, where we've got valued, committed, and motivated. And it is worth saying that these are coming out across all the surveys that we looked at, come out very strongly as the top three, both for the positive and the negative. After we know the feelings, the next most important question is always why. So we do need to delve deeper into it to figure out what to do next. And it's particularly interesting for the retention question, actually, that if we look at the negative side, there isn't really a dominant theme as to why. We know the feelings are there and we know that they're very strong, but there's a whole multitude of reasons why that could be, which this is interesting because it's actually not typical, I should say. Generally, if you filtered by negative answers to any other survey question, for example, if you were looking at a well-being question and filtered by the negative, you'd likely see workload probably coming out as an issue. You would generally see more of a picture, but here it's not so clear. Fortunately, on the positive side, it is really tight-knit. We know exactly why people are choosing to stay. We've got personal commitment, commitment to the organisation, commitment to team. So it's commitment all the way through, which is very typical. That is what we would see. So what that leads us to say, really, is that we need to focus on dialing that up. How do we tap into that commitment further? And luckily, that is something we know about. There's lots of research around what makes people feel committed. Around purpose, sense of connection. And I think Dom's going to touch on this a little bit more soon, some more practical steps so that we can see a little bit more of that and what we can actually do.
But Jodie, just right there, like, I hope for everyone listening, like, this is massive value to go, we know the top three emotions that are causing people to say they're going to leave the organization. It's this disconnected, which is so key because that speaks so clearly to what the issue is. They become disconnected from the organization, the irritation and the anxiety. They're all three quite different emotions. And just to reinforce the point you made for everyone, what we found so far, and remember we said this story and this narrative is emerging, is that the theme, the reason why for the disconnection, irritation, and anxious could be anything, is in a sense, I think, would that be fair, Jodie, what you're saying? Could be a multitude. Whereas on the other side, why they are choosing to stay and saying, no, I'm going to be here in 12 months is actually super clear. It's commitment to that team, it's commitment to the organization, and it's their own personal commitment to the job in hand. So I'm hoping everyone's going, this is actually really useful, because for us, we were like, whoa, this is so helpful. And actually, we'll be sharing a lot more of this with our own clients and going into more detail, but we wanted to kind of put it out there to the world. But let me let you continue. So I'll put over the
No, absolutely. I think that's really interesting. And I think it's worth touching on disconnected there as well, with the way that comes out, because that's in some sense is more of a new emotion since the pandemic that we've seen shoot up. And obviously we can understand why, with all the working from home, people feeling more isolated. So it's really interesting how closely that links in with retention, and why the retention crisis has come about now as well, and why it's such a key issue at the moment. So
sorry, just a quick question in from Chris saying, do we see more hygiene factor themes emerge out of more disengaged respondents? So, you know, pay, conditions, etc., versus motivator factors, so pride, inclusion, career development, from the more engaged respondents?
Generally speaking, it didn't come up in terms of retention, but around engagement in general, I would say that would be a way that you can see the results for sure.
Yeah, I was going to agree on Dom, your view, but certainly from the data we looked at, we couldn't see that hygiene factors were more or less significant. There was seemed to be no statistical kind of something that stood out there when it came to that versus motivator.
No, that's right. It's much more the factors that you talked about. Yeah.
But this, what we're going on to now, sorry, I'll let you speak to this, is quite interesting around what is motivating them to stay.
Exactly, that's it. So it wasn't one of the key questions. So these questions are the question themes that we see down the left-hand side here. These are the key questions where retention had the biggest impact. And lots of them we would perhaps expect to see there, but this is the evidence for it. This is behind it, proving it. So I won't go into detail too much on each of these figures individually, because I think they speak for themselves, really. They're quite striking, the difference between them. So obviously what we're seeing is that pride, inclusion, career development, all really key aspects of engagement that we've got down here as well, having this big impact. So the data, again, just to explain quickly, we've got the figures in the green are those positive scores to those questions based on that positive population who have said they're going to stay. So again, that is the majority of respondents, that 87%, versus the scores when we look at those 13% that have said they're going to leave. So these are some really clear indicators, and definitely worth watching as these questions start to drop. So I think this ties into what we mentioned at the start. I'll just loop back to that as well, how you don't necessarily need to have that retention question in there. You can look at those emotions and themes and your other key indicators, because some of these questions may well be in engagement index scores as well. So you've already got that information.
Yeah, it's a good point. Sorry, interrupt. There's just there's high correlation between these and retention and emotion and retention. So you can get the leading indicators actually from your emotions without necessarily needing to ask that specific question now. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's sum up what we've just seen. First point, of course, is listen to what people are telling you. The data is all there. They're saying they're going to leave. We saw how close those figures were around those who say in a survey that they're going to leave, and the actual average turnover rates. Secondly, high engagement and high positive emotion scores do go hand in hand with high retention. And of the two, the emotions, as we saw, is that leading indicator. It is the one that we can influence. So it's the one that we need to focus on. Once people have hit the other side, once they're feeling negative, they're already halfway out the door. So we do have to focus on those reasons why they're staying, as we saw, dialing up that commitment. And finally, if we're not asking people, how do you know? It's so important that we're looking out for those key indicators and checking in regularly. So I think this kind of leads us nicely into time to look at some practical steps. So
yeah, Jodie, just before I hand over to Dom, firstly, thank you for that. Thank you for pulling all that data together, and that's one of the great things that I know you're enjoying doing. For everyone listening, is kind of looking across data from multiple companies and tens of thousands of points of data allows you to start to see some of these big themes. And Jodie, I know we can't say too much yet, but we are actually going a step further now as a company, and we are working with a number of companies to take their attrition data and overlay it onto the engagement data and the emotions data and the performance management, so we can start to see, is there an issue here with how the manager, so if a manager gets a low score for how they're managing their team, right? And we can see that people are leaving and their emotions are negative, you've suddenly got the whole thing. And actually, if we can see it before it happens, and that's why we need probably about 9 to 12 months of data. So we're just at the start of this. We can actually start to say, we know that if they feel this emotion 6 months out, we know from looking at all the previous data, they almost certainly leave. And we know that if the performance of the manager gets kind of this score, again, we're sort of correlating these three key pieces of data: the emotion, the performance management, and the attrition. So for those coming, that'll be coming over the next 12 months. But that's something I know you're looking forward to working on.
Absolutely, tying that in with the employee life cycle as well, and seeing what stage those things happen at. I think it will give us so much data.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to hand over to Dom to take us on to some just kind of some really key areas to think about for you. Now, you've heard kind of some of this content and what we're seeing and what we're beginning to see. Dom, why don't you share us what do participants do? We always want to be really earthy and really real.
Yeah.
So practically, what do I do based on what you've said?
Yeah, I think this comes from the data we've looked at, but also working with clients, conversations with clients. And really, these 7 steps that I go through, they're really designed to help you have a conversation with senior people. It gives you a structure, third-party structure, to have a conversation, and then to start to assess how your organization's doing on each of these 7 things. So let's look at what they are. The first one may seem a bit counterintuitive, particularly for those of us who class ourselves as people. We surely want to treat everybody the same. And broadly speaking, that's right. But when it comes to retention, we need to really focus on the people who are most important to our organization and the people who are high performers, because high performers tend to have lots of self-efficacy, which means that they'll know their worth and they'll also know what opportunities are available to them. So they're the people most likely to go. So it's important to look at key individuals and say, how do we make sure we connect with them, we understand what's important with them, as far as we can, we give them what they're needing from the organization. But more broadly also, it's important to start to think about who actually do we need to keep. And we use these 4 C's to help categorize. So character, people are reliable; chemistry, they fit in with their teams, they fit in with the organization; competence, clearly they can do their job well; and culture, they live by our values. Now, we want everybody to do all of these things, but at different times, different things are important. And it's really useful to actually agree